So thank you all so much for coming to hear me, fart around about undeniably my favorite group of all time, the mighty OutKast. And yesterday wasn't necessarily a performance; it was more like a snippet. But we can talk about that during the Q&A. We ain't gonna talk about that right now. So what I'm doing in this current book project that I'm working on and trying to finish, by the grace of God, is theorizing the understanding of how hip-hop helps us think about and update conversations about Black folks in the South after the formerly organized civil rights movement. Now, for the historians in the room, I am not trying to historicize Southern hip-hop. I'm a cultural studies theorist, so I get a little bit of wiggle room and talk about what is and what is not what folks call the post-civil rights South. So I just wanted to put that out there. If you want the historical version, my best bet would probably tell you to look at Dr. Maurice Hobson, Legend of the Black Mecca. He does such a phenomenal job that I don't have to reinvent the wheel. So if you need that aspect. However, I've been thinking about hip-hop in terms of its connection to the South. When we have conversations about the South, particularly Black folks in the South, we automatically stop at three major social historical moments. You think about the antebellum South, the slave era, so like the whole Gone with the Wind, it wasn't that fabulous, contrary to popular belief. You get into Reconstruction and Jim Crow, which is probably your most visually recognizable understanding of prejudice, the Jim Crow era, segregation at its finest. And then you get to the organized civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s, and then that's it. And a lot of people like to say that the civil rights movement is the most modern representation and is still applicable to how we understand the South in its current moment. And as a Southerner who was born way after the civil rights movement, I'm like, how do we include us in the conversation? Where do you include contemporary young Black Southerners in a conversation that's not necessarily checking for them, let alone making space for them to articulate their experiences, their challenges? Because a couple of things are happening. One, you have a generational anxiety between older generations of Southern Black folks who are around during the Civil Rights Movement, who are around during the Jim Crow era, who are like, we marched for you to basically take advantage of what we have, the idea of the mountaintop, right? Martin Luther King Jr. gives you this idea of the mountaintop. We have given you the tools to reach the mountaintop. Younger Southern Black folks are like, we surely appreciate you. However, the mountaintop ain't flat. There is no blueprint. There is no promise that because there's legislation on the books, because we have been seen nationally, internationally as the focal point of this struggle for Black folks' rights, that they are being implemented on a daily basis. So when I theorize that the mountaintop ain't flat, and I do say ain't, I know, English professor, I know, but I like ain't, so I used it. It's not flat, meaning that there is no blueprint, there is no understanding way to kind of maneuver this unfound terrain. And hip hop is a way to do that, which makes me think about the hip hop South. So for me, the hip hop South is a use of hip hop culture as a point of entry to update standard narratives of Southern Black life and culture after the Civil Rights Movement. It's actually an extension of the term Dirty South. So if you're familiar with Southern hip hop, you understand that everybody's like all Dirty South, everything, right? When Cool Breeze coined this term, Dirty South, he was talking about the actual rap scene as it was and what that looked like in the South. What I like to suggest is that the hip-hop South is an extension of that and its application to how we understand and think about the social cultural landscape currently in place and also cultural production in the South during the same era. And one of the best ways to do that is to think about the group OutKast. But before we get into that, it's okay to say, oh, I was cute. Okay. This is way before Dr. Bradley. This is just Gina Mae. Just Gina Mae, 1998, freshman in high school, had the black Keds, white socks, lanky. That was probably my favorite jersey to wear every other week. But I moved to Albany, not to be confused with Albany, New York. No, Albany with an I, Benny, okay? Transplanted to Albany in 1998. My grandparents were educators, but they were raised and born in the Jim Crow era, so everything that I knew about being Southern and Black for the most part was coming from their perspective. And some of those heirlooms, let's say, that transferred over from that upbringing were reflective of the segregation era that they came up in. You know, you don't necessarily trust white folks. You smile at them. You don't look them directly in the face for more than 5 seconds. You know, and especially me being from Albany, which is the crowning failure of the civil rights movement, you wouldn't have any of the other significant progressives that Dr. King had in Selma and Montgomery without Albany, right? You know, we just weren't ready for that dream. We didn't want to share it. And he got ran out of town, literally got ran out of town. Somebody paid his, you know, it's the street committee, so we don't know who did it, but somebody paid his bond to get out. And he was like, it made me rethink about my approaches to how we're thinking about this idea of freedom and how we get there. So on the one end, I am basically the new Jim Crow reincarnated with my grandparents. But in this other ear, I was like, oh, there's something else going on. So I was listening to, you know, not just OutKast, I was listening to Goody Mob. I was listening to Lil Jon and the East Side Boys. I was listening to Pastor Troy. I was in high school when Ain't No More Playing GA came out, and that was the anthem. And I was like, damn it, I am a down south Georgia girl, because hip hop told me so. So on the one hand, I'm hearing this like more familiar landscape about what the South is and what it's not, and it's in conversation, it's in debate with what my grandparents are telling me this is what it means to be Southern and Black. So I'm just like, how do I maneuver? How do I think through these things? And that's when I was like, duh, hip hop. But the problem with that is, remember, I said I was a transplant, so I was in Washington, D.C. Go aside. They were Little New York, or at least they thought they were Little New York. So all the Wu-Tangs and the Nas and the Busta Rhymes, and all, I knew that. I could recite that. But then I got down to Albany, and they were like, no, we don't listen to that. That's not us, Shouter. That ain't. What's wrong with you? What's wrong with you? So hip hop, I started really thinking more in depth about how hip hop was helping me shape this kind of landscape that I was trying to maneuver as somebody who was young, Southern, and Black. So I was, you know, this is from the CD book, right? I have a good old CD book, the one you ready to fight people if they took your CDs and put them out of order. Well, so I had a couple of things up there. I had Field Mob because Benny girl, okay? So definitely want to know how you go from ashy to classy besides using lotion, okay? Lil Jon and the East Side Boys, Put Your Hood Up, Missy, So Addicted, T.I. with Trap Music, Ludacris, Word of Mouth, OutKast with Aquemini, Pastor Troy, like I was telling you. We Ready, I Declare War. And then obviously Goody Mob and Still Standing. So hip hop was these major things that were taking place. I wasn't trying to theorize Southern hip hop when I was 14 and 15 years old. I was just like, this knocks. This sounds so good in my friend's hoopty Toyota Corolla that I'm like, you know, we can make this work. Maybe. But it wasn't until I got into graduate school that, you know, I was starting to wonder why I was being left out of critical conversations about hip hop as a Southerner. So I was in a seminar class with Dr. Portia Maltsby, who's like the OG of all Black music, popular music, Black studies. And we were in our music seminar, popular Black music seminar. We get to our unit on hip hop and we name out all the folks, Trisha Rose, Mark Anthony Neal. And it was interesting because in that group, there were 4 out of 7 folks were from the South. You had Florida, you had Georgia, you had Texas. And we kind of just like had these conversations. You know, you look at somebody, you have a whole conversation, you really don't have to say nothing. So we're talking about Black noise, we're talking about, you know, soul babies and everything like that, and we're just like, what about us? There's no conversations on Goody Mob, there's no conversations on OutKast, there's no conversations on Scarface. How do you forget Scarface? And so I was feeling myself that day, and I raised my hand, and I was like, so where does the South fit into this conversation about hip hop? And Dr. Maltsby, bless her heart, she was like, what are you gonna do about it? And I'm like, ma'am, I'm trying to get out your class first. I'm just trying to, you know, get up out of here. But then she planted those seeds to help me start thinking about how can we think about Southern hip hop in particular as a critical framework for addressing culture, identity, and regionalism. And, you know, I started to think about it, and then the dissertation happened, and you don't think about nothing else but the dissertation. So you can do stuff like this. And I really started thinking about OutKast. And it was 2014, and I was at a hip-hop literacy conference at Ohio State, and I was with my people, and we were like, yeah, we're celebrating all these 20th anniversaries that are coming up. And folks was like, Nas, that's all we're going to talk about, Nas. And we were like, but Southern Playlistic Cadillac Music also came out in 1994. Why ain't nobody talking about OutKast? Damn it, why? And I was like, let me hit up a couple of my closest friends. And I'm like, yo, do you want to talk about OutKast for like 15, 20 minutes about why they're important and why we love them? And they were like, certainly. So I was thinking 2 or 3 episode project ended up being a 40 episode long series that's still on the YouTubes. And I was like, no, for real, how do we think about OutKast? How do we think about these brothers that Big Rube said were operating under the crooked American system too long on the True Dat interlude on Southern Playlistic Cadillac Music? How do we think about OutKast as theoreticians of this idea of Southernness? Because that's exactly what they do. So that's what we're going to walk through today. Not necessarily the whole book project, but the actual OutKast chapter, which is also talking about how we chronicle Stankonia. How do we chronicle this idea of world building in the contemporary Black South? I just love this little gif. I'm telling you, So folks are like, I still don't know what you're talking about. OutKast is comprised of 2 members. Okay, you got Antoine, Big Boy, Patton, and Andre 3000, Benjamin. If you're really about that life, then you're like, what about CeeLo? CeeLo's supposed to be the 3rd member of OutKast, but they were like, nope, we're gonna make you a Goody Mob, and the rest is history from there. They released Southern Playlistic Cadillac Music in 1994. This April on the 26th is the 25th anniversary of Southern Playlistic. They're eligible for the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. So we'll see. And what I theorize is that their albums are an exploration and reconceptualizing of the American South after the Civil Rights Movement. And it's really interesting because they start off with something really familiar with the city of Atlanta, and they slowly move away from it in order to be more experimental in how they articulate and define their Southern identity. And as I go through, we'll talk about it. So Greg Tate basically threw shade at me one time and was like, you can't talk about OutKast or any kind of music without music. So it's a little something for the folks who aren't familiar. It lets us be great. Right, you never look at roses the same way again, right? So kind of got a feeling about it. So let's start from the jump. Let's start from the first album, Southern Playlistic Cadillac Music. So it was the first album to establish the city of Atlanta as not only a city, but a hip hop city. So when folks like Imani Perry are defining and theorizing this idea of an urban South, she is referencing OutKast and how we do that. Because contrary to popular belief, now we think about Atlanta, we don't think twice about it being the city that everybody wants to come from. The jokes now, I think the city of Atlanta posted something on their Facebook last night that was like, all right, Super Bowl's over, get out. Right? Because there's something about this city that folks come and they're just like, you know what, we like it here. We're not going nowhere. And folks are like, no, for real, out, get out. Right? But that is very recent, last 10, 15 years or so, that Atlanta has been, undeniably this metropolitan space, this, Black Mecca, if you would. But in 1994, that was definitely not the case. So if you were to read Dr. Hobson's book, The Legend of the Black Mecca, he talks about how Atlanta was in this transitional phase when Southern Playlistic came out. They were trying to support the idea and the slogan that Atlanta is the city too busy to hate. They were trying to get the bid for the 1996 Olympics. So they were trying to present Atlanta as this pristine, safe, it's okay to bring your kids here, space. And they were focusing on stuff like R&B, funk, right? So before we even knew about Atlanta as a hip hop city, Atlanta was definitely a funk city because of folks like Bunny Jackson, who was the former wife of Maynard Jackson, and she was the manager of groups like the SOS Band and Cameo. And it wasn't until I got older that I started thinking about my introduction for real to Southern hip hop was through my father, because a lot of the influences of Atlanta funk bands, Brick, SOS, Cameo, when the Gap Band came down to visit, those were like my dad's favorite groups. He would always come to Atlanta for Funk Fest every August. But I was able to think about like this genealogy of music that Atlanta produces. That's like, we've been talking about Black experiences, but you basically are catching up with us. And when LaFace Records comes to Atlanta in the early 1990s, L.A. Reid and Babyface weren't looking for hip hop. They were looking for R&B. So of course they're going to go looking for a TLC, a Toni Braxton, an Usher, right? Ursher for the folks who say it right. And it was more of an R&B feel. It was something that you could put on your white linen suit and your sandals and be like, okay, we're gonna go have these little block parties, these rooftop parties. And folks who were Southern hip hop artists were like, no. What we not gonna do is discount and negate the experiences of working class Black African Americans in the city. So hip hop was a way to archive and document those experiences that were being pushed to the side in favor of presenting Atlanta as this transient, diverse, everybody is welcome city. So when OutKast comes out with Southern Playalistic in 1994, it's important to note the significance of organized noise. So organized noise consists of 3 main members. If you've been on Netflix, you can watch The Art of Organized Noise to really get the lowdown on who they are. But they're important because they were establishing a sonic imprint of Southernness that had not been introduced to the South previously. So when you have folks like a Sleepy Brown, for example, whose falsetto reminds you of somebody like a Curtis Mayfield, it's because his daddy was in Brick and he was on the side listening to the funk music. So when he was like, let's produce something that for real sounds funky, let's take you on a funky ride, live instrumentation is so significant for them because it helps them stand apart from others, especially thinking about the production of hip hop, the sonic accompaniment, when you have ideas like sampling and going through the record stores. And they did that, but the live instrumentation was so significant for them that they were like, let us show you what the South really sounds like. It goes through what folks call the car test. If it don't knock in your car, we not gonna listen to you no more. We're gonna be like, oh, that is so unfortunate. Next. But if it catches my attention, it's like the old folks say, if the beat hits my spirit, then we'll give you a more serious listen. And that's said in the actual name itself, Southern Playalistic Cadillac music. This is music for you to go on the run. This is Sunday music. This is riding music. This is, if you went to the park on Sundays and the cars were open, this is what we want you to listen to when you go to those park parties on Sunday, right? But then, they come out and you have Dee Dee Gibbler, Miss Peaches, who opens up the whole album and she's like, this is something for you, right? And the significance of a Black woman, particularly a Southern Black woman, introducing this iconic, even then folks were like, what the hell is this? Iconic Southern rap album in ways that, especially during this time period, a lot of folks were highly upset about the misogyny of hip hop and the women hating in hip hop. And here you have them showing love, right? You're starting an album that's very significant, okay? And you have all these things. So you have stuff like, you have cuts like Deep, you have the actual cut Southern Playalistic Cadillac music. If you watch the Diddy documentary and he talks about doing the video for Players Ball, right? He says he's the reason that Andre 3000 don't keep on a shirt these days. But also it's kind of important that you're actually looking at how New York in particular, the Northeast aesthetics of hip hop, were having to kind of grudgingly look at this possibility of the South being able to produce quote unquote true hip hop. So then you get to the Source Awards. And the Source Awards were named after the Source magazine, and if anybody remembers the Source magazine, you got the magazine, you automatically went to the back. You didn't start at the front, you went to the back, because that's where you had your ratings, your 5 mic ratings. So 5 mics is a classic album. This album is perfection. And every year they would get together and be like, okay, we're gonna have an award show, who was the best, whatever. And nobody really has critically engaged why the 1995 Source Awards were so big. Well, one, it's like the height of the East Coast, West Coast beef in hip hop at that time. So you have Diddy and the East Coast folks and Bad Boy, and then you got Suge Knight, who does his infamous, if you don't want your producer dancing in the videos, come to death row, right? You got a very upset Snoop Dogg who is yelling at a dominantly New York group. You don't love us, you don't love the West Coast. No, sir, no, they don't love you, okay? And then you have OutKast and Goody Mob, who are sitting there kind of like, what the hell is going on? And you get the, so then Salt and Pepper and Kid and Play, they're like, okay, this is the award for best new duo. So they name a group Smith & Wesson. So if you're really about that life, Smith & Wesson was like the closest thing to gangster rap that New York was going to get at the time. And they were New York, so they thought it was going to be a shoo-in for the win because New York hip-hop, it just goes together, right? And they open up the little envelope, and then they're like, it's in their voice. If you ever listen to Chonky Fire on Aquemini, you can hear the actual sound bite. And they're like, oh, OutKast. And you hear this like wave of booing. So they come up there and, contrary to popular belief, Big Boy is the biggest instigator in hip hop. And I'm gonna tell you why in just a second. So he comes up there and he's trying to be all diplomatic. We like appreciate y'all for being letting us in your city. But then he says one thing that all Southern black folks know means that he wants you to start something. He was like, so Dre, what's up? And this is pre-Badu now. This is everybody wants to say that Erykah Badu is the reason that, Andre went all bohemian and countrified goodness. But he was there in his purple and white dashiki. He had his little teeny weeny fro going on. And he was clearly upset. He was mad. And he was like, I'm sick and tired of y'all. First of all, he was like, oh, tell us why you mad, sir. And then he gives the rallying cry that folks still go to today. The South got something to say, and that's all I got to say. So it was like folks in Texas, Louisiana, Georgia, they were like, oh, we got something to say? Bet, let's run it. So it's like, so it opens up this gateway for all of these other Southern artists. So for the record, OutKast is not your first Southern hip hop group. They are not your first Southern hip hop group. But he opened the door. They opened the door to recognize the UGKs, the Ghetto Boys, the Master P's, and all of those folks. And they're like, oh, okay, so the South has something going on. And they're like, okay. So they got rejected. And they're like, oh, so you don't want us to be part of Northeast hip hop? You don't want us to be part of the West Coast hip hop? Well, we going out of space. So you go from the city of Atlanta, which is physically, culturally grounded in the region of the South, what we understand the South to be, and we remove those physical boundaries. So this idea of Southness, not to be confused with Southernness. Southness is the actual physical location. Southernness is the cultural experience. And they're like, we gonna be Atlanta aliens or AT aliens. So you have this recreation of Southern boundaries in the Southern world. You move the city of Atlanta from being landlocked at the top of the state to the city of Savannah, right? Which is, on purpose. One, because Big Boy still has roots. He's from Savannah. But also it's like we're going to literally play around and experiment with what the Southern region can and cannot do. And they also start to play a little bit more with, kind of like these EMD sounds, right? Like if you listen to the opening of After You May Die, which is the opening, but you actually listen to the beginning of AT Aliens, it sounds like you're in outer space somewhere. You have like, the shooting lasers and what space is supposed to sound like, which is blank, I guess. And they're playing around with these ideas of self-actualization and expression, and a lot of folks will connect that to the idea of Afrofuturism, the use of black folks taking in technology, science fiction, and creating and seeing themselves in ways that weren't allowed or aren't allowed in other cultural spaces. So you have the AT Aliens, you also have the video Elevators. And if you listen to Elevators, you have a wood block that sounds like a ticking clock. So there is an awareness of time. The idea of time is infinite, time is mortal. And the video itself has them returning to the motherland, so to speak, which is actually this idea of Ethiopia or Africa, and them being aliens and being chased by basically ICE in hazmat suits. So I'm just saying, in hazmat suits, so they're borrowing from, movies like Aliens and Predator in particular, and they're leaving these invisible imprints so that folks can follow them. So signifying on this idea of the Underground Railroad, because the Underground Railroad is one of the main ways that folks understand South and Southern black folks, and they're like, come and follow us. Follow us to the future. Follow us to freedom. What does freedom look like? Freedom is being allowed to articulate your truth and experiences outside of these parameters and concepts that are either tired and played out or not available to us to use and to install. So you have this basically like big diss to hip hop in general. That's like, we don't need you to tell us what hip hop can and cannot do. We're gonna establish the idea of world building. So then you get to Aquemini, which today is my favorite. It's my favorite today. Tomorrow, ask me, it might be something different. But this third album is akin to a sonic memoir. They are taking you back through what folks expected them to be as Southern rap artists. So they have these revisitations, for example. If you think about songs like The Art of Storytelling Part 1, right? They're having like this kind of coming of age moment for them when they first tried to holler, right? You got Susie Screw and you got Sasha Thumper, and this idea of like a tragic comedic black girl. What does that look like? We never really talk about black girls, especially Southern black girls, in these spaces. And here you have Andre talking about, you know, I met this girl, you know, all she wanted to do was be alive, right? Which could connect to somebody like a Kiese Layman in his first novel, Long Division, where he has his main female protagonist, Shania Crump, who's like, can you help me find myself in the future? I just want to be alive. So him taking this kind of like critical framework that OutKast is presenting as a form of storytelling and using it to set up his own analysis and his own form of narration, which I'll talk about in a different part of the book. But there's these previous touchstones of Southern Black identity that they talk about on these different albums. So like if we're talking about ACLians, there is this fear of dependency on technology, which is in Synthesizer. But it's also a nod back to that funk influence because you have George Clinton who does his own weird bebop on that song, in addition to screeching technology. And like by screeching technology is literally, it's something that is supposed to jar your ear. It's not pleasant listening. They're like, no, we want you to really pay attention to this possibility that maybe we're over dependent on technology and that will be, you know, a problem, right? It also goes through this idea of working nostalgia. So it's like this idea of revisiting the past. So I played a little bit of Rosa Parks. And it's interesting because Rosa Parks' name is never mentioned in the song, not once. It's just the name of the song, Rosa Parks. But what had happened was folks were upset, particularly folks in her estate were upset. We will find out later that it wasn't Rosa Parks who was pushing for them suing for, you know, copyright violation. It was her family trying to get, you know, paid, get that check. And kind of revisiting this idea of the civil rights movement. So you talk about the iconography associated with Rosa Parks moving to the back of the bus, and they put that in the chorus, right? Hush that fuss, everybody move to the back of the bus. But it's also re-signifying and kind of like undermining what that meant. So if you ever rode the bus to school, well, for the most part, you knew that the back of the bus was where the cool kids were at. You wanted to be in the back of the bus. You weren't necessarily thinking about segregation. You weren't thinking about protest. You wanted to be where the cool kids were at. They were in the back of the bus. On top of that, you also revisit this understanding of the back of the bus and the coolness of it, because instead of referencing Rosa Parks directly, he talks about Spike Lee's Get on the Bus, which is also talking about a moment in civil rights lore, contemporary civil rights history, thinking about the Million Man March, but like changing up how you dictate what the iconography of the bus means in Southern literature and popular culture. So revisiting these important cultural and historical landmarks, if you will, and remixing them, if you will, to speak to a contemporary Southern Black experience. And then finally, on that album, you also grapple with the question of what does it mean to be free or get free, right? And freedom here doesn't necessarily mean being able to walk in whatever door you want to. It doesn't necessarily mean the lack of bondage. Freedom here for them is they have made it. They are officially on hip hop's mainstream radar. They are successful. They have a little bit of money. So they're like, how do we still maintain having a sense of freedom? So you almost have this triad of freedom requests at the end of the album: Nathaniel, Liberation, and Chunky Fire. So Nathaniel is them talking to Big Boy's cousin, Nathaniel, who was still in prison, and he literally freestyles about trying to be free over the phone, and they make that part of the album. That leads into the next song, which is Liberation, which is 7 minutes of a rain stick and CeeLo hollering at you like a backwoods pastor, and you're good with it because you're getting your feelings. No, seriously, so when they had the Dungeon Family reunion, what was that, 2016? at one music fest, like people I didn't even know. We were having church when everybody sang their part on liberation, and my husband was just like, "What are you doing?" I'm like, "Shh, we're having a moment. I don't know these people, but these are my family, these are my people." So it was like you have this question of freedom as a form of spirituality, liberation as a form of theory, liberation as a form of being able to simply be. Can you still be free and have problems? Can you still be free and not have access to your creative process? Can you still be free and still say I'm part of the South? Can black folks really be free in the South? I don't know, we're gonna talk about it. And then you finally have Chunky Fire, which is this really quirky, out of tune electric guitar, and Andre talking about, you know, if it's Chunky Fire, getting the rats about the hole. So we're not talking about the Pied Piper in the way we talk about R. Kelly. We're talking about the actual getting rid of the rats, right? What does that mean? And then they end the song with a sound bite, a sound clip. They literally sample themselves being booed at the Source Awards, symbolizing this is it. It's the last time we're going to talk about the Source Awards. It's the last time we're going to question whether or not we're good enough. We're going to basically reclaim our own narrative, reclaim our own position as OutKast, because that's what we do. And then it starts to slow down like a dying tape, or the battery is running out of a radio, and then it finally just cuts off and ends. And that's the end of the album, right? But it's important though, because if you listen to the Art of Storytelling Part 2, and they say, meet me at the center of the earth. So you have the science fiction idea of the center of the earth, but for them, the center of the earth is the dungeon. And the dungeon is where Organized Noise was Rico Wade's mama's basement, and it was where they first got their start. It was them returning to the beginning. So when you get to Stankonia, and Stankonia opens with them saying, live from the center of the earth, you have this idea of an apocalypse has happened, because the Art of Storytelling Part 2 is basically what would the last rhyme we ever wrote, what would it sound like before the earth is destroyed. And you get to Stankonia and they say live from the center of the earth, and the one thing that survived this newfound world that they're talking about is hip hop. Hip hop. Not New York hip hop, not West Coast hip hop. Us, the South. The South with an F, okay? Not TH, an F. So when you get Stankonia in 2000, it is like a dispatch. This is what we're thinking about. This is what we're playing around with. They are literally creating this new world with the South as the center of identity, the South as the center of understanding politicking, the South as the center of music. And Stankonia is this new world, this idea of the new South. And it's also important to think about Stankonia as a sonic and conceptual departure, because this is where you first see Earth Tone 3, their production company, along with their DJ, Mr. DJ, David Sheets. And they take over the majority of the production. So it's the beginning of a new chapter for them. So Organized Noise is found on a couple of the songs, out of like, I think it was like 24 songs on that album. And Organized Noise did maybe 2 or 3. So it was them establishing themselves as being able to produce their own, not only produce the lyrics, but also produce what they wanted the South to sound like. And the South was pulling from a little bit of everything. When I talked to David Sheets about probably one of the best known, besides Miss Jackson, which is B.O.B., Bonds Over Baghdad, he said that they went to a rave the night before. And when they went back to the studio, they were like, we want it to sound like you could play this at a rave. And they were pulling from these different experiences in ways that Organized Noise was sonically connected to this funk legacy. They were trying to establish and reestablish themselves as Southerners that were able to experiment, continue to experiment from their previous albums and that production. So I'm actually going to stop right here. So don't come for me because I didn't talk about Hey Ya and Love, the Love Below and Speaker Box. The reason that I don't is for 2 reasons. One, most folks who say that they're OutKast fans, that's where they start. Like last night, let's talk about it. You have Big Boy come out, he got on the ATL in his jacket, I want it, babe. And he does all of 30 seconds of I like the way you move. And folks are like, ah! And then, like, I was so mad at how conveniently Adam Levine slid off the ATLiens jacket and went back into, like, Maroon 5. And I'm like, that told me all I need to know. That told me all I need to know. But that is where folks start. They listen to Hey Ya, right? Like the Coachella, when they did their 20th anniversary tour at Coachella. They went through their entire catalog. And I was in my living room with it blasting like I was there. And then as soon as they finished singing Hey Ya, which they had never performed live because they stopped touring before that album actually came out. And folks were like, okay, we heard it, and we're starting to leave. And I'm just like, what is wrong with you people? They gave you the whole catalog. They went from Southern Playalistic all the way through, and folks were leaving. And it's kind of the same thing, is that we want to talk about OutKast, but we really don't want to talk about OutKast. We want to talk about safe OutKast. We want to talk about In Your Feelings Andre. We want to talk about the pimp, Big Boy. We don't want to give them the complexity that we allow for other popular culture artists to have. OutKast is complicated. They're complicated in ways that, you can do party music and self-conscious music. That's one of the things that I love about Southern hip-hop, is that we can make you shake your butt, but we also make you think. Two of those things can happen at the same time. You're shaking your butt here, and then the next song, you're like, you know what, let me think about the social economic conditions. Let me think about the significance of poverty and working class, and what does that do to connect to regionalism? Because you know what, CeeLo, you're right, I need to get up and get out. Right? So it's really important for us to kind of think about that. And then ultimately, OutKast, that's their, I guess we can count Out a While, but it wasn't really an album per se. But after 2006, OutKast kind of disappears. Big Boy is still doing his thing, but we still want to be like, no, we don't give Big Boy credit as an independent artist. We like to say, Big Boy, the one half of OutKast. Like, and you're like, but he's doing his own thing. And it's great, and he's still grinding, but we don't give him that same critical attention as, say, an Andre, when he drops 16 bars and disappears for 5 years. Yeah. Like, we're still like, come on back, Andre, please. Every time we hear something from him, we don't give Big Boy his due. So this is me giving Big Boy his due. He's all that in the back of chips. Thank you very much. So ultimately, that leaves us with the question of, where do we go from here? How do we continue to think about hip-hop as a critical framework for addressing ideas of region, cultural, and identity? So I start with OutKast, but my students and I talk about this all the time. We have these conversations about, I'm not a Future scholar. I'm not a Migos scholar. I'm not a 21 scholar. I listen, but I don't listen with the same critical ear that I do to those folks that I came up with, in the same way that they're coming up with them. So for the young students in the audience, this is your shot. Like, if you want to talk about why Future is significant and helps you think about mental illness and everything like that, this is your shot. This is where we pick up, because I shouldn't be the only one studying Southern hip hop. I just want to kind of set up shop to let other young scholars study Southern hip hop and show that the South got something to say, not just production-wise, but also critically, scholarship-wise. We need to address how it ebbs and flows in the South. We need to think about how it looks about the South in rural Southern spaces. Because, I'm from way, way outside the perimeter. We didn't have MARTA. We had tractors on the road. Everything closed at 5 o'clock on Sunday. We didn't have this idea of mass transit. So that's something to think about, is like, how can we think about Southern hip hop as a gauge for, distinctions within the region itself? Rural Southernness, urban Southernness, suburban Southernness. And how those things change, especially after Hurricane Katrina. Because Hurricane Katrina not only physically reshaped what we understand the South to be, but also culturally reshaped what we understand the South to be, because folks were evacuated, folks moved around. And when you move around, what do you bring with you? What you came up with. So it's not like you're a clean slate you bring about with you. How do you experience life? How do you approach these experiences? And it mixes with whatever the local color is, and that we get these new profound ideas about what the South can and cannot do. So, it's my Nana Boo. I had to catch her when she wasn't looking. So thank you so much for listening to me ramble about the mighty OutKast. At this time, I'm happy to take questions, comments, and snide remarks.